Wednesday, April the 26th, 1989, Shvi'i Shel Pesach, followed by Saturday, April the 29th, 1989, Sidra Acharei Mot. In the Chumashim on page 268, book of Exodus, chapter 14, verse 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward, and you lift up your rod and hold out your arm over the sea and split it, so that the Israelites may march into the sea on dry ground. And I will stiffen the hearts of the Egyptians so that they go in after them. And I will assert my authority against Pharaoh and all his warriors, his chariots and his horsemen. Let the Egyptians know that I am Lord, when I assert my authority against Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen." The angel of God, who had been going ahead of the Israelite army, now moved and followed behind them. And the pillar of cloud shifted from in front of them and took up a place behind them, and it came between the army of the Egyptians and the army of Israel. Thus there was a cloud with the darkness, and it cast a spell upon the night, so that the one could not come near to the other all through the night. Then Moses held out his arm over the sea, and the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind all that night, and turned the sea into dry ground. The waters were split, and the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians came in pursuit after them into the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen. At the morning watch, the Lord looked down upon the Egyptian army from a pillar of fire and cloud, and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He locked the wheels of their chariots, so that they moved forward with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Hold out your arm over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians and upon their chariots and upon their horsemen." Moses held out his arm over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal state, and the Egyptians fled at its approach. But the Lord hurled the Egyptians into the sea. The waters turned back and covered the chariots and the horsemen, Pharaoh's entire army that had followed after them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites marched through the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord delivered Israel that day from the Egyptians. Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore of the sea. And when Israel saw the wondrous power which the Lord had wielded against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord. They had faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. They said, "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and might. He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will enshrine him, the God of my father, and I will exalt him. The Lord, the warrior, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea, and the pick of his officers are drowned in the sea of reeds. The deeps covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the foe. In your great triumph you break your opponents. You send forth your fury, it consumes them like straw. At the blast of your nostrils the waters piled up. The floods stood straight like a wall. The deeps froze in the heart of the sea. The foe said, "I will pursue. I will overtake. I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will bear my sword. My hands shall subdue them." You made your wind blow. The sea covered them. They sank like lead in the majestic waters. Who is like you, O Lord, among the celestials? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, working wonders? You put out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your love you lead the people you redeemed. In your strength you guide them to your holy abode. The peoples hear, they tremble, agony grips the dwellers in Philistia. Now are the clans of Edom dismayed, the tribes of Moab, trembling grips them. All the dwellers in Canaan are aghast. Terror and dread descend upon them. Through the might of your arm, they are still as stone. Till your people cross over, O Lord. Till your people cross, whom you have ransomed. You will bring them and plant them in your own mountain, the place you made to dwell in, O Lord. The sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands established, the Lord will reign forever and ever. For the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and horsemen went into the sea, and the Lord turned back on them the waters of the sea. But the Israelites marched on dry ground in the midst of the sea. Then Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her in dance with timbrels, and Miriam chanted for them. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. Then Moses caused Israel to set out from the Sea of Reeds. They went on into the wilderness of Shur. They traveled 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. They came to Marah, but they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. That is why it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, What shall we drink? So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There he made for them a fixed rule, and there he put them to test. He said, If you will heed the Lord your God diligently, doing what is upright in his sight, giving ear to his commandments, and keeping all his laws, then I will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians. For I, the Lord, am your healer. The second reading is Numbers 28, verse 19. It is found in the Chumashim on page 695. Page 695 in the Chumashim, Numbers chapter 28, verse 19. You shall present an offering by fire, a burnt offering to the Lord. 2 bulls of the herd, 1 ram, and 7 yearling lambs. See that they are without blemish. The meal offering with them shall be of choice flour with oil mixed in. Prepare 3/10 of a measure for a bull, 2/10 for a ram. And for each of the 7 lambs, prepare 1/10 of a measure. And there shall be 1 goat for a sin offering to make expiation in your behalf. You shall present these in addition to the morning portion of the regular burnt offering. You shall offer the like daily for 7 days as food, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord. They shall be offered with their libations in addition to the regular burnt offering. And the 7th day shall be a sacred occasion for you. You shall not work at your occupations. The third reading is in the Chumashim on page 1017. Page 1017 in the Chumashim. Second book of Samuel, chapter 22, verse 1. David addressed the words of this song to the Lord after the Lord had saved him from the hands of all his enemies and from the hands of Saul. He said, O Lord, my crag, my fastness, my deliverer, O God, the rock wherein I take shelter, my shield, my mighty champion, my fortress and refuge, my Savior, you who rescue me from violence. All praise, I called on the Lord, and I was delivered from my enemies. For the breakers of death encompassed me. The torrents of Belial terrified me. The snares of Sheol encircled me. The toils of death engulfed me. In my anguish I called on the Lord, cried out to my God. In his abode he heard my voice. My cry entered his ears. Then the earth rocked and quaked. The foundations of heaven shook, rocked by his indignation. Smoke went up from his nostrils. From his mouth came devouring fire. Live coals blazed forth from him. He bent the sky and came down, thick cloud beneath his feet. He mounted a cherub and flew. He was seen on the wings of the wind. He made pavilions of darkness about him, dripping clouds, huge thunderheads. In the brilliance before him blazed fiery coals. The Lord thundered forth from heaven. The Most High sent forth his voice. He let loose bolts and scattered them, lightning, and put them to rout. The bed of the sea was exposed. The foundations of the world were laid bare by the mighty roaring of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. He reached down from on high. He took me, drew me out of the mighty waters. He rescued me from my enemies so strong, from foes too mighty for me. They attacked me on my day of calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me out to freedom. He rescued me because he was pleased with me. The Lord rewarded me according to my merit. He requited the cleanness of my hands. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not been guilty before my God. I am mindful of all his rules and have not departed from his laws. I have been blameless before him and have guarded myself against sinning. And the Lord has requited my merit according to my purity in his sight. With the loyal, you deal loyally. With the blameless hero, blamelessly. With the pure, you act in purity. And with the perverse, you are wily. To humble folk you give victory, and you look with scorn on the haughty. You, O Lord, are my lamp. The Lord lights up my darkness. With you I can rush a barrier. With my God I can scale a wall. The way of God is perfect. The word of the Lord is pure. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. Matthew.
I'm always struck that neither the Egyptians nor the Hebrews believed, and yet, of course, the Egyptians were punished in order that the Hebrews believed. I mean, they came across, and the Hebrews said, "What did you do this to? We're going to die here." Weren't they great to me?
Okay, let me put that as a question to the congregation before responding to it myself. Matthew is raising an interesting question. He is saying that the Egyptians were faithless and the Hebrews, the Israelites, were faithless. And yet the Israelites were saved and the Egyptians were drowned. Why? We're not talking about Moses now. We're talking about the Israelites. They were faithless. Every inch of the way, they complained. They had to be dragged by their tefillin. They didn't want to move. They were hungry. They missed the food. This was a great act of redemption, and they were faithless. And Matthew is saying, why were they delivered then if they were faithless? Howard.
I think this was just a total accident. The Hebrews were lucky that God happened to fasten on them as the chosen people, not because of any intrinsic worth or merit of this group of people, but just because they happened to be in the right place at the right time. And I think that's the ultimate answer to all of this concern with chauvinism and Bhakavanu as opposed to anything else. It's not any kind of superiority. They just happen to be on the right side of the line.
And they survived. In other words, the survivors write the history. Doris?
I was just going to say that if the Egyptians had written it, it would have been the other way around.
Yes. In other words, the Egyptians would have written it from a completely different point of view. Everybody writes history from their own perspective, but ultimately it's the ones who survive who tell the tale. But there is, I think, included in the question that Matthew asked and which I rephrased, something that's a little more subtle and something which relates very closely to an aspect of Christian theology, which clearly has its roots in Hebraic thought, but nevertheless in Christianity is taken a stage further and becomes more precise. There is, in certain segments of Christian thinking, the notion that whether or not one is saved, whether or not one is delivered, I'm using the word salvation now. This is a word, as all of you who remember, Rabbi Kaplan was constantly trying to explain, but never feeling that he really got through. Rabbi Kaplan complained bitterly that people said that salvation was a Christian word. He spoke about God as the power making for salvation. And he would say to me, and how well I remember, he'd said, they don't understand, they think it's Christianity. He says, Hine el Yeshuati evtach v'lo evchad. Behold, God is my salvation, I will not be afraid. From the Havdalah ceremony, a verse from the Bible. Or Ha'el, Melech Ozer, Umoshia Umagein, from the Amidah. Melech, King, Ozer, who helps us, Umoshia, and delivers us, gives us salvation. Of course, the problem that Rabbi Kaplan was facing was the distinction between two kinds of salvation. And he, understandably and legitimately, wanted to give the word a new meaning. You know, I'm sure all of you have bought the new edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. And you know that one of the great things about that new dictionary, as the old dictionary, but now it's even better because all the addenda and corrigenda have been brought in, thanks to the computer age, into the main body of the dictionary. You can trace the history of a word, when a word was used. Rabbi Kaplan wanted to rewrite the definition of salvation so that in a future edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, salvation would have two distinct meanings. One meaning would be an exclusively supernaturalist meaning. It would mean the kind of delivery which David seems to be talking about in the Haftarah this morning, where God literally yanks him out of a narrow place and delivers him. The theological meaning of the term, of course, is what the Christians call grace. And in many Christian sects, whether one is saved or not, whether or not one is a candidate for salvation, whether or not one qualifies for salvation, Matthew, has absolutely nothing to do with one's works. A person who has led a perfectly good life might not find himself saved at the end of time, and a person who has led the life of a criminal might find himself saved. This notion is especially well known in Swiss theology. It comes through in Calvinism. The whole notion of predestination, although it has a prehistory. The notion that you see, the trick is you don't know who is saved and who isn't. You could say, if somebody will please tell me, I'll go and live what the Greeks call a chazer shetog, because since I am not saved anyway, why not go and live off the fat of the land? On the other hand, you never know. You never know until you get up there or down there, and then it's too late. So the idea is that a person has to live their whole life not knowing whether they are saved or not, with the notion and the knowledge that acts, deeds, do not save. And what Rabbi Kaplan wanted to do was to bring in a completely different notion of salvation. What he wanted to do was to translate the concept of salvation from the idiom of supernaturalism into the idiom of naturalism. And for him, what salvation meant was what it means to somebody like Carl Rogers, what it means to somebody like Abraham Maslow, what it means to those psychologists today who speak of self-fulfillment. That is to say, it is a humanistic term. It has nothing to do with a God up there. It has to do with naturalistic, humanistic issues. Rabbi Kaplan simply meant Judaism should provide salvation for Jews, which means that being a Jew should elicit the best in the Jew. That being Jewish should make the Jew feel that he is living a full life, not in the sense of materialism, although the fulfillment does not necessarily exclude materialism. It's not a monastic life, it's not a celibate life, it's not a chaste life, it's not a life of deprivation we're talking about. But Rabbi Kaplan wanted to take the word salvation from the universe of discourse of supernaturalism and place it squarely in the realm of naturalism. And now the question here also arises in Jewish tradition, the same issue that Calvin raised. Who is saved and who is not saved? And there are many Jewish traditions which indicate that even within Judaism, it is not clear that the reason why an individual is saved is because the fact that he led a good life. The man may have been a total criminal and maybe just performed one good act. And because of that one good act, he was saved. A little bit like making confession on one's deathbed. The idea that one can live a life of total wickedness and depravity, but if one manages to get the priest, who can fail to remember that marvelous scene in Brideshead Revisited, where Lord Marchmain is dying, and the family is surrounding the bed, knowing that he has lived from a Catholic point of view, the kind of life which is going to lead him straight to hell, waiting for his paralyzed arms to make the sign of the cross. This surely has to be one of the most graphic moments in the 20th century in terms of religion. And of course, finally the hand moves. It's not certain until he's made the last movement in the shape of the cross. Thank God, his brain is still functioning, his heart is still beating, he is saved. This is a very difficult notion, and Matthew is raising this question. The Talmud tells many stories about thoroughly worthless human beings who, because of one act, were saved. The Midrash tells the story of one of the most wicked Babylonian kings who wrote a letter to Hezekiah, and the inscription on the letter was, "To Hezekiah, king of Israel, and to the God of Israel." And he mailed the letter. And then he had second thoughts, and he thought, well, since I'm writing, I might as well put the God first. So he took the letter out of the box and rewrote the inscription, "To the God of Israel and to the king of Israel, Hezekiah." And God says, according to the Midrash, this wicked man who destroyed the temple, yet he took 3 steps towards the mailbox in my honor, he will raise 3 righteous children who will teach Torah in public. I mean, there are righteous people who live their whole lives righteous and they're not saved. There's something completely wrong. Saul Lieberman, in a marvelous book called Greek in Ancient Palestine, tells the story of the brothel keeper who was once invited to pray for the congregation on a fast day in connection with rain. In ancient Israel, rain was absolutely imperative. And we prayed for rain on Shemini Atzeret. If rain didn't come, a special fast was called for. There's a special Masechet in the Talmud called Masechet Ta'anit, which deals almost exclusively with the rules and regulations governing what one does on a fast day. And the first thing one did on a fast day was to find the most spiritual member of the community to lead the congregation in prayer. And this brothel keeper was invited to lead the congregation in prayer, and the community was absolutely bewildered. They didn't understand. As a matter of fact, his name was Pentakakos in Greek, which means 5 wicked things. We won't go into the details right now, but in addition to being a brothel maker, he had a few other jobs on the side. And Rabbi Abahu said to him after the praying, he said, and the prayer worked, the rain came. He said, "I don't understand." He said, I've looked at your CV. There isn't a single line here which is meritorious. What on earth came over the Ribono Shel Olam in telling us that you were the man to bring rain? And he said, "I have no idea." And he thought, and finally he said, "Well, there was one decent thing that I did. Once after a war, a Jewish girl was taken into captivity. A Jewish girl came into the brothel, and I said, 'What are you doing here? This is not a job for a nice Jewish girl.' And she says, 'I have to make some money because my husband has been taken and put into prison by the Romans. If I don't ransom him, they're going to kill him.' And Pentakakos said, all right, you don't have to bother to stay. Here's the money, go get out of my sight." And Rabbi Abahu said, "That's why you were asked to lead the congregation in prayer." Now, Matthew, we get back to your original point. You assumed that God rewards people according to their merits. This will be wonderful. In other words, good people will be rewarded and bad people will be punished. This is the problem of theodicy. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way with individuals, and it doesn't work that way with... What is your name?
My name is Rita Resnick.
Rita Resnick.
I'm a pupil of Judah Kahn.
You don't have to give us your CV. I welcome you in your own right. I see that you've been davening this morning. That's good enough for me.
Important because he was a pupil
Of Rabbi Kaplan. Not only was he a pupil, Judah Kahn was not only a pupil of Rabbi Kaplan, he used to be the rabbi of the Metropolitan Synagogue, and he was also on the editorial board of the Reconstructionist magazine a long time ago when I used to attend the meetings of the editorial board.
But it hurts me, Rabbi, that when we think about these things, salvation,
Rita? Why do we need somebody to come back from some other place to tell us about it? Why can't we find, as Rabbi Kaplan urged us to find, the meaning of life in this world? I'm not saying that there may not be another place. There's always been at the back of my mind the thought that one day I will die, and there God will be sitting on a big throne with a big yarmulke, looking just like the cantor in my father's synagogue. And he'll say to me, Miller, I told you not to get mixed up with those people at the SAJ. Now, I mean, it's only a fantasy. But it's a fantasy. I do think about it occasionally. Not all the time, just occasionally. My father is dead. I said Yizkor for my father today. My father lives. He lives in me. He lives in my children. He lives in this congregation. Every child who is taught by me takes something of my father from me to wherever they go, wherever they settle. My father is large. He contains multitudes. The thought has never occurred to me that he might live some ectoplasmic existence on some other planet looking down, observing me, although I love him to be around for a few minutes at least, not for a long time. One doesn't want... Parental visits should be fairly brief, I think, as one gets older. However, it would be. Some of you were in synagogue when my sister was here a few weeks ago. Quite spontaneously, she also thought, what would our Father think? What would our Father think? It's something that often happens to people. I'm thinking now of a line from Freud's interpretation of dreams when Napoleon was crowned in the Notre Dame Cathedral, and he leaned over to his brother Joseph and gave him a nudge, and he said, I wonder what Monsieur Notre Père would make, his father. He wonder what our dad would make of all this right now, me being king, because the father was dead by then. I without any embarrassment, preach a doctrine of Yizkor which finds good enough meaning. The Bible talks about perfection. I don't talk about perfection. Good enough meaning in the sense that a dead father can live, or a dead mother, or a dead brother, or sister, or spouse, or even child can live on, not only in the way one conducts one's life, but coming back to Matthew's point, because sometimes when I look at my father's life, I look at my life, and I consider all those, Rita, all those crossroads when one could have taken the wrong turning. Verstehst? All those times when one could have taken the wrong turning, I think in addition to feeling that the dead live, there is also the sense that whatever salvation one has in the sense of having a life in which one is fulfilled, one has the capacity to be creative, one is able to eat, one is able to sleep, one is able to walk, one is able to move around on one's own feet. All those things that we take so much for granted, that these things are not due to anything that I have done which merits that. That is to say, to be able to do what I do, I don't feel I've done anything to deserve it. I feel the way Matthew felt about the Israelites, that nothing that we do deserves the gift of life. Nothing that we do deserves the gift of being restored to health when we are sick. Nothing that we have done ever has been sufficient for us to be rewarded with children or with grandchildren and all the joy and nachas and aggravation that comes from the process of raising them. We are all unworthy in a fundamental sense, and yet we are alive. And on some sense, Yizkor, which means may God remember, from our point of view, is an injunction to us. It says to us, remember, like on the Yiddish, gedenk, zachor, remember. This is what Yizkor says to us, remember. Jacob?
Poetic imagery in the Torah reading. There's all this water, tons of water, blood, and it's the salvation.
Only in the Torah reading?
Just what I'm talking about, just what we read.
But in the Haftarah also there's water all over the place.
I just want this imagery in the Torah. All this water and the salvation of the Jews. Right after that, there's no water. And then when they find water, it's
That's beautiful. Interesting. No?
well, I thought
Well, is that all you're going to say? That's beautiful. That is beautiful. The readings today are full of water. Water, billows, sinking into the depths. Water everywhere. And all of a sudden, there's no water. And then when they find the water is bitter. I need a response. Help. Has anybody got any ideas? Rosin? You raised your head. I thought you were going to buy. You want to try? No, there's obviously something being said there, but what is actually being said escapes me right now. We go over again and again this notion that the Shavu'i Shel Pesach commemorates the crossing of the Red Sea. In terms of the myth, this is the day on which the anniversary of the crossing of the Red Sea, when the waters parted. So obviously it's a birthing metaphor. But what you say is much more profound. That is to say, why all this water and then suddenly bitterness? Ricky.
I want to look at two directions. First, back to Egypt and
Yes.
Nile.
Yes.
The first plague being the water of God in Egypt being turned to blood and turning from the death to the life-giving tree. And it has something to do with that. I can't put it together completely.
Well, you're very helpful, Ricky. You've started. Ricky makes a very interesting suggestion that the Hebrews, the Israelites, had just left Egypt, a place which worshipped water. That is to say, the Nile River, with its rising and falling each year, was a god, was a divinity. As a matter of fact, Pharaoh was worshipped as the river, as well as many other manifestations.
Yeah, I can put it together. Because right afterward, after the water, Moses throws in some wood and it sweetens the water. They're able to drink. And they're told, now if you obey these injunctions, you won't get the diseases of Egypt. And so, such a modest promise after this deliverance. You won't get sick if you wear a scarf. I mean, it's so...
In other words, they've just crossed the Sahara Desert, and now they're being told that if you wear a scarf, you won't catch cold. Right.
And what you have to do is obey these laws, not worship
Right.
the water and the god of Egypt.
Right.
So it's really been a very, very big shift.
Mhm.
And so the very end of it sounds so mundane, because that's what we're really more used to hearing. And the rest is so phantasmagoric. We went from Egypt through this great, fantastic, wonderful sounding and exciting. And then we're back here to real life. Our stars would be good, would be taken care of, would be by law and order.
I think, Joel?
I think on some level, what happens afterwards is a collective postpartum depression.
Bravo. That's very good. Nevertheless, we have to follow Ricky's line of thinking, and I think she has a point here that after all this water is over, God says, I am your doctor. By the way, this is the verse that I think that Mary Nelson Eddy, Christian scientist, took. I'm mixing up the one who invented electricity. You see, Rita? What can I do? All right. Now, I know I read it sometimes on the corner of West 96th Street, and there's one of those Christian Science buildings there. What about Egypt and water? What about Egypt and magic, you see? We were talking on the first day of Pesach about the fact that the central thrust in this entire biblical procedure here is oversimplified. God is saying to the Jewish people, listen, I can give, it began with Shabbat Hagadol. All that you need, I can give you. I'm oversimplifying this, and I'm putting this in very anthropomorphic, supernaturalistic language because it's the simplest way of doing it. You'll all make your own translations according to your level of supernaturalism or naturalism. God is saying, listen, everything that you need to survive, I'm going to give you. But don't try to twist my arm. Act ethically. And if you act ethically, you'll get everything you need. And above all, don't do what the Egyptians used to do. The Egyptians used to act magically. they had all their khartumim. We read in the book of Shemot how all the Egyptian magicians were able to do almost everything. Finally, they were beaten by God, by the Jewish God, but basically they were very smart, the Egyptian magicians. And what God seems to be saying to the Jewish people here is, listen, you've been redeemed. You've become a people. All this water, don't let it go to your head. I'm going to turn the water bitter deliberately, just to teach you a lesson, that the water in and of itself is not salvific. It is not the water that provides salvation. It is God who causes the water to rise and fall. And you must draw a radical... You see, to come out of Egypt was literally, was to come out of not just the house of bondage, but the house of magic. Ancient Egypt specialized in magic, amulets, incantations, the book of the dead, the ritualistic prayers, the tombs, the various prayers in hieroglyphics to protect the soul, the ka, the ba. The entire religion was based on magic. How do you take a group of people and move them from magic to ethics? We better rise for Aleinu. We better rise for Aleinu. On page 382.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת ולה ליוצא בראשית, שנתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם.
The Moel proceeds with the service. I wish to say a few words of explanation about the ceremony which is taking place here at the SAJ on Shabbat morning. When a bris is taking place between the end of Shacharit and before Ein Kamocha. One might describe it as the original naming of a baby ceremony. As members of the SAJ know, we name the girl child in the synagogue during the course of an aliyah, but a male child, a Jewish boy, is always given his name at the circumcision ceremony. When we have a naming ceremony for a boy at the SAJ, we change the tense. We say, whose name was given to him at his bris as. Because the tradition in Jewish history is that the child has his name on the occasion of his bris, if he is a boy. Now, we have a mazel in our synagogue. This is the first time in as many years as I remember, at least since 1961, that we have had occasion to have a bris. Nobody ever got born on Shabbos before. Gekommen am Mazel Tov, a glick, as they say. A good fortune came to us so that we can celebrate this mitzvah together. Two words in the ceremony, sandek and kvater or kvaterin. If you look on page 743, there is a note in the Birnbaum prayer book which indicates that the word sandek has been identified with a Greek term synteknos, literally denoting with the child, and the sandek is the one whose privilege it is to hold the child on his knees during the operation, and in medieval times he became known as Gottvater, which became Gevater by abbreviation, and then Kvater. Called etymology, I suppose, or the way in which words change. And later, there was a division between sandek and kvater, so that two different people became involved, and this is the tradition that will be followed this morning. We welcome all members of the family of the child who is to be circumcised. We will say something more about the family later on. In the meantime, I just want to draw your attention to page 743, the paragraph which Rabbi Propis has and the family have graciously privileged me to recite, which will be the naming of the child. You look at page 743, the third paragraph, line 5. You see a verse from the book of Ezekiel. I want to read that verse. It was drawn to our attention recently by Carl Pellman, only 2 weeks ago on Shabbat morning. Va'evor alayich, va'erech mitbosset b'damayich, va'omar lach b'damayich chayi, va'omar lach b'damayich chayi. I passed by you and saw you weltering in your blood. Live through your blood, I said to you. Live through your blood. According to Jewish tradition, Abraham was the first to be circumcised at a ripe old age. I think Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised. And his son, Ishmael and Isaac, were circumcised Ishmael was circumcised when he was already at advanced age. I think he was 13. But Isaac was the first Jewish child to be circumcised on the 8th day. And that is referred to also in the bris ceremony. Vayamol Abraham et Yitzchak bano ben Shimonat Yamin. However, there were 2 occasions in Jewish history when, according to legend, there was a collective circumcision. One was the night before Yetziat Mitzrayim, the night before the Jews left Egypt, when apparently because of the burden of the servitude and the bondage, they had let this mitzvah lapse, and they were all circumcised before they left Egypt. And remember that the blood of the lamb was sprinkled on the doorposts of the house, and this is the first circumcision, collective circumcision, that Ezekiel is referring to. He said, I saw you as you left Egypt with the blood of the collective circumcision, and I said, through this you shall live. And the second occasion we read on the 7th day of Passover, before the Jews entered the promised land, they were asked to take charvot surim, flint knives, and circumcise all those Jews who had wandered through the wilderness. And this was the second time when there had been a collective circumcision. Since then, Jews have been circumcised individually on the 8th day. I want to draw attention, however, to 2 other factors, because those of you who do not have a traditional background may be somewhat perplexed at a surgical procedure taking place in synagogue on a Shabbat morning. First of all, it is and it isn't a surgical procedure. Of course it's a surgical procedure, and any doctor who wasn't a Moel could perform this ceremony. As a matter of fact, according to my information, it is a superior procedure to the surgical procedure that is full circumcision in a hospital, because Rabbi Propus does not use stitches. And it may interest you to know, those of you who are interested in such things, that when Prince Charles was circumcised in England, they used a Moel to circumcise him, because it was regarded that the Jewish method of circumcision was superior to the one that was used in hospitals. You can make of that whatever you want to. A royal child we have this morning. When in the second pre-Christian century Jews were persecuted by the Syrian Greeks, one of the points which the Syrian Greek soldiers used to mock the Jewish women about was when they circumcised their children. We have it on record from the books of Maccabees that the soldiers would mock these women. They would say, why are you circumcising your children today? Tomorrow we will hang those children round your necks and throw you from the top of a roof. And the women, according to Jewish tradition, said, today we will do our Jewish thing, and tomorrow you will do your Syrian Greek thing. In Auschwitz, in the concentration camps, the same experience happened. Jewish women circumcised their male children in Auschwitz, and mother and child were thrown into the gas chambers the next day. The bris is the covenant. It supersedes all other Jewish traditions. The bris takes place even on Yom Kippur, even on the Day of Atonement, even on Shabbat. It is the symbol of Am Yisrael Chai. There has never been an occasion in our lifetime when we needed to reaffirm that proposition, Am Yisrael Chai. We are enormously grateful to Danny and Sandy Divak Moss and their family for having the genius to produce a baby on Shabbos, so we could all benefit from the mitzvah. Rabbi Propus, it's all yours. Chumashim on page 485. Leviticus chapter 17, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelite people, and say to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. If any man of the house of Israel slaughters an ox or sheep or goat in the camp, or does so outside of the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord before the Lord's tabernacle, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood. That man shall be cut off from among his people." This is in order that the Israelites may bring the sacrifices which they have been making in the open, that they may bring them before the Lord to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and offer them as sacrifices of well-being to the Lord. The priest may dash the blood against the altar of the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and turn the fat into smoke as a pleasing odor to the Lord, and that they may offer their sacrifices no more to the goat demons after whom they stray. This shall be to them a law for all time throughout the ages. Say to them further, if any man of the house of Israel or of the strangers who reside among them offers a burnt offering or a sacrifice, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it to the Lord, that man shall be cut off from his people. And if any man of the house of Israel or of the strangers who reside among them partakes of any blood, I will set my face against the person who partakes of the blood, and I will cut him off from among his kin. For the life of the flesh is in the blood. I have assigned it to you for making expiation for your lives upon the altar. It is the blood as life that effects expiation. Therefore I say to the Israelite people, no person among you shall partake of blood, nor shall the stranger who resides among you partake of blood. And if any Israelite or any stranger who resides among them hunts down an animal or a bird that may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with earth. For the life of all flesh, its blood is its life. Therefore I say to the Israelite people, you shall not partake of the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is its blood. Anyone who partakes of it shall be cut off. Any person, whether citizen or stranger, who eats what has died or has been torn by beasts, shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. Then he shall be clean. But if he does not wash his clothes and bathe his body, he shall bear his guilt. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, I, the Lord, am your God. You shall not copy the practices of the land of Egypt where you dwell, or of the land of Canaan to which I am taking you, nor shall you follow their laws. My rules alone shall you observe, and faithfully obey my laws. I, the Lord, am your God. You shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which man shall live. I am the Lord. None of you shall come near any one of his own flesh to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. Your father's nakedness, that is the nakedness of your mother, you shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. The nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's, whether born into the household or outside, do not uncover their nakedness. The nakedness of your son's daughter or of your father's daughter, do not uncover their nakedness, for their nakedness is yours. The nakedness of your father's wife's daughter who was born into your father's household, she is your sister. Do not uncover her nakedness. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's flesh. Do not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is your mother's flesh. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. Do not approach his wife. She is your aunt. Do not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. Do not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is the nakedness of your brother. Do not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter, nor shall you marry her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter and uncover her nakedness. They are kindred. It is depravity. Do not marry a woman as a rival to her sister and uncover her nakedness in the other's lifetime. Do not come near a woman during her period of uncleanness to uncover her nakedness. Do not have carnal relations with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Do not allow any of your offspring to be offered up to Moloch, and do not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. turn in the Chumashim to the second reading on page 509. In the Chumashim on page 509. The 9th chapter of the book of Amos, verse 7, on page 509 in the Chumashim. To me, O Israelites, you are just like the Ethiopians, declares the Lord. True, I brought Israel up from the land of Egypt, but also the Philistines from Kaftor and the Arameans from Kir. Behold, the Lord God has his eye upon the sinful kingdom. I will wipe it off the face of the earth. But I will not wholly wipe out the house of Jacob, declares the Lord. For I will give the order and shake the house of Israel. Through all the nations, as one shakes sand in a sieve and not a pebble falls to the ground. All the sinners of my people shall perish by the sword, who boast, never shall the evil overtake us or come near us. In that day, I will set up again the fallen booth of David. I will mend its breaches and set up its ruins anew. I will build it firm as in the days of old, so that they shall possess the rest of Edom, and all the nations once attached to my name, declares the Lord, who will bring this to pass. A time is coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman shall meet the reaper, and the treader of grapes him who holds the bag of seed, when the mountains shall drip wine, and all the hills shall wave with grain. I will restore my people Israel. They shall rebuild ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine. They shall till gardens and eat their fruits. And I will plant them upon their soil, never more to be uprooted from the soil I have given them, said the Lord your God. Leonard. The 18th chapter of the book of Leviticus. The forbidden degrees of marriage. That is exactly the same reading that is read on the afternoon service, the Mincha service of the Day of Atonement. We read the whole chapter. We cut short. For those of you whom we welcome to services in our synagogue for the first time today, we are a traditionalist synagogue, but we do not read the entire Sidra each week. We follow the triennial cycle, which is an ancient pattern, but also keep in line with the rest of the Jewish worshipping world. So each year we read a third. The reading that Leonard is referring to is the entire 18th chapter of the book of Leviticus, which is read at Mincha, afternoon service on the Day of Atonement. We happen to be just at this point. I just want those who are visiting us today not to think that we chose this reading especially for you. It just worked out that way, all right? Leonard. Just let me repeat that because I don't think you can all hear. What Leonard is drawing attention to is that by a strange coincidence, the early part of the Sedra, Acharei Mot, which is from which we read the reading today, the early part is the morning reading of the Day of Atonement. The morning reading of the Day of Atonement begins, Acharei Mot Shnei Bnei Aaron. It describes what happens after the two sons of Aaron, Nadav and Rabbi, who were accidentally killed because they offered strange fire before God, and the subsequent ritual which takes place on the Day of Atonement. This comes from the same Sidra. So in fact, in an Orthodox synagogue today, the entire reading, both for the morning of Yom Kippur and the afternoon of Yom Kippur, would be included in the service. Leonard, your point. Leonard is asking a very interesting question. First of all, let me say briefly, as I'm sure those of you who are accustomed to going to synagogues, even though it may not be this synagogue, many readings in the Torah, which is our sacred myth, we read more than once in the course of any given year. As you know, we read the entire Torah, the 5 books of Moses, through, either as in Orthodox synagogues, the entire text, or as in synagogues that follow the triennial cycle, the 3-year cycle, which incidentally is a very ancient tradition. It goes back over 2,000 years. The custom of reading the entire Siddur was a late development. We read a section from the Bible, as today, not only when it is due to be read at the time of the year, when it comes up. Right now it happens to be today. But in addition, these readings are often associated with a particular festival. For example, the story of the binding of Isaac. We read in the book of Genesis, and when we read the book of Genesis during the year, it happens sometime during the winter. But we also read the story of the binding of Isaac on Rosh Hashanah. So it's a little bit like meeting somebody at a bris and meeting somebody when you're rushing down Fifth Avenue to meet somebody for lunch. It's like meeting somebody sort of en passant, casually, in the course of the ordinary annual routine, and when you have the occasion to look at the text a little more closely, as we're doing this morning. And although Leonard is not asking a formal question, he is reacting and saying, well, isn't it curious that of all the parts of the Bible that might have been used for the Day of Atonement, the majority of the readings come from the Sidra, which begins after these 2 young men were killed. Well, of course, the Day of Atonement is about atonement, and it's about our fears of being punished for our sins. And the children of Aaron were punished because they had sinned. And so it may well be that part of the reason, although I don't think this is the entire answer, Leonard, may have been that this had some association to do with the aura of the death of those 2 boys. As if to say, it hangs over. After all said and done, what do we say? What do we say in Yom Kippur? We say, on Rosh Hashanah, we say, may you be written and inscribed in the book of life. The Sefer Chaim, Tikatei v'Techateim. And we alter the liturgy during the high holiday period. We say, Zochreinu l'chaim, melech chafek b'chaim, v'chotveinu b'Sefer HaChaim, l'ma'at Elohim Chaim. You don't have to be rabbis to hear that the word Chaim, which also Jews say when they lift up a glass of good scotch and say, l'chaim. I have problems with the pronunciation, but not with the contents of the goblet. That is to say, when we say l'chaim, we mean to life. Unfortunately, the 2 boys died. For whatever reason they died. Whether you believe the literal reasons the Bible gives us, or whether you say maybe it was an accident. Maybe something happened, and they had to find an explanation for why they died. At any rate, Yom Kippur and death and life are very closely related. Of course, the obvious answer to the second question, Leonard, is that the Sidra Achrimot includes the laws of the ritual for the Day of Atonement, which is appropriate for the day. Jeff? Excuse me, one moment. First of all, most but not all. Jeff is saying that most of the readings seem to deal with incest, and he is talking as if this is something that happened a long time ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure I don't have to inform you that incest has become big business in the last quarter of the 20th century. So I just wanted to correct this notion, Jeff, that we are reading some archaic document that has no bearing whatsoever on life today. Since the last quarter of the 19th century, or perhaps even a little earlier, novels, works of art, increasingly have been dealing with the issue of incest, and in the last 30 years, perhaps even the last 20 years, incest has become central topic on theater, on television, and also in prime watching time. So just in case people think because something is written in the biblical idiom is old hat, do me a favor. This is a central crying issue. It has to do with child abuse, which is, we are just beginning. We are at the tip of the iceberg of understanding what child abuse means in our society. Yes, dear friends, you It is something which affects people not just who live on 125th Street and north. It is something which affects our society, and the issue which is raised by the Torah is as urgent as it is today. Jeff, stop. I'm sorry, I let you carry on. Jeff says that incest is regarded by most people in our society as an abomination. I'm just questioning that, Jeff. I am telling you in terms of my understanding of what is being going on in life and in literature over the last 100 years, this is a very present, current issue. And although you may not like the idea, and I don't know why you don't, I don't know what your reasons are, I know what my reasons are. My reasons have very much to do with the profound psychology of human beings and the absolutely imperative nature of the need to separate the bonds that bind mother and child, father and child, brother and sister, that in order to become fully autonomous, mature human beings, it is imperative to break ties with family. Although I wish our children, especially when they become teenage, could do it with a little more rahmanas. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The fact is, it has to be done. And one of the most painful things in the life of everybody is a moment in time when the child breaks away from the parent, and the only satisfaction we all can have is that the child will grow up to become a parent and have the same sorrows themselves in the fulfillment of time. Jeff. Now, I'm sorry, that's a sin for which I will atone at some point on the Day of Atonement. Jeff. Let me just add that, yes, Dolores, please. Let me see if I can read what Dolores said, because she spoke very, very quietly, and I wasn't sure that I got everything myself. Dolores seems to be saying that it is normal for children to have sexual desire for these objects, which of course is obvious. I mean, the incest prohibition is believed to be universal. Nobody prohibits something that people don't want to do. I mean, there wouldn't be any point in saying no if we didn't all want to do this. But I think what you are further, and incidentally, by the way, from what we understand of the development of human beings, how it comes about that that lovely little baby that was circumcised on the bima this morning will hopefully grow up and be able to divest himself of the relationship, will have feelings about his parents, but then will be able to separate from that and turn his attentions to some more appropriate lifelong companion for him, you see. I think what I hear Dolores saying is that one has to go through the initial desire towards the parent or the incestuous object, and then separate, and then some of that original desire becomes focused on the other object that one hopefully chooses. Do I correct faithfully? It's necessary for it to happen. Yes, so Dolores is more or less underlining what has been said, that unless people are able to make that sharp break, then they later have problems. I mean, how many people are faced with a kind of a problem when a husband and wife have something that goes on between them? Instead of the husband and wife dealing with this situation between the husband and wife, the husband or the wife goes back to mama. That is a destructive thing to do in a marriage. A terribly corrosive thing to do in a human relationship when the two principals, the husband and the wife, can't deal with the issue in terms of each other, however difficult it is, but they have to go in and bring mama or papa down to sort of bring in some heavyweight from that. Dolores? Well, Dolores is saying something that's a little more painful. When husbands and wives start arguing and then they try to set the children against one or the other, to get the children into the quarrel and say to the son or the daughter, I'm right, aren't I? And so you have these unholy alliances between, for example, a mother and a son against the father, which is one of the more classical unholy alliances, which leads to some of the problems that the author of the 18th chapter of the book of Leviticus describes. What is your name? Joanne? Joanne. Excuse me, Joanne. You brought your parents to shul last week? So I know you. I'm sorry. I'm Joanne. My eyesight is going. That's all I can say. No, Joanne. Good. Could you talk a little louder, Joanne? Yes, I greatly appreciate that Joanne connects the emotional, intellectual, and feelings that she had during the reading this morning with what is happening currently to that young woman who was attacked in Central Park, and I think it also involves our own reactions. I mean, I had two completely wrong reactions. I'm afraid I can't even wait till next Yom Kippur to confess them. My first reaction was, any woman who runs on the transverse at 102nd Street is asking for trouble. I was wrong, and I apologize for having that feeling. Anybody should have the right to run anywhere in the city without fear of having their head bashed in with a brick. The second was, well, what do you expect of black children who come from the gutter? The fact was these children may have been black, but they didn't come from the gutter. Their names were mentioned in the New York Times, and every single one of them came from middle-class, structured families. Some of them were good students, and the issue is the issue of violence in our society. The issue of the random shedding of blood. The issue of the number of murders that take place every day. The issue of people who have to be strapped to the walls of jails because the prisoner says, I've killed so many people, you can't do anything to me anymore, to which our natural reaction is, let's put them in the electric chair. Let's electrocute them. Let's give them lethal injections. And yet, only 2 days ago, a black man who had been accused of killing people over 21 years ago was suddenly discovered to have been innocent. And had we killed that man, this society would have shed the blood of one innocent man. And killing one innocent man in Jewish tradition is the equivalent of killing the entire human race. And therefore capital punishment is inhumane and against everything that Jewish sensibility and everything that human sensibility should be against. And yet what I'm saying is that we are only human beings, that we have certain feelings that we are thoroughly ashamed of, but hopefully even though we may express these feelings when we are feeling a little below what we ought to be feeling like, there comes a time when we have to pull ourselves together and realize that they are only from the dark side of our consciousness, and that we should try to take it a little further. Alan, since this is your bar mitzvah, as it were, and I have to congratulate you on reciting the Haftarah this morning so beautifully, only 2 mistakes, but the cantor will see you afterwards, long before Yom Kippur, to deal with you on that issue. Alan and I go back a long time. Please, Alan. I'm sorry. I beg your pardon. You wanted. What is your name? Dasha. Okay. I'm sorry, Alan. She did have her hand up first. I'm sorry. Well, I'll try to do that, but I tell you, between you and me, I don't offer this congregation too much consolation because I want to keep them on their toes. But we will give some words of consolation when I wrap up at the end. And we're not going to run as long as we usually run because we do have a kiddush and there was a bris, and so we're running a little behind. I bear your comment in mind, Doctor, and I'll come back to it later on. Alan? Do your own thing, in other words. Right. Right. Howard? Goat demons. Right. Let me just briefly go back to the point that Alan made, because it's a very striking point. We've just, after all, finished the festival of Passover, and I just drew your attention this morning during the circumcision ceremony to the verse that Carl Pellman drew our attention to about the notion of the blood being essential. What I hear Alan saying is that when you have to found or create a nation, there's no way of doing it without shedding blood, your own and others. There's no way of settling a land. There's no way of getting a place for yourself on the face of the earth without blood. However, once you have got that place, once you have that foothold, then you've got to start thinking in terms of taming the desire to shed blood, and that But these laws are an attempt to transmute the more violent laws, because the whole of Passover, there's blood all over the place. We spill the wine from our cups during the plagues as if to indicate that the blood is flowing over. The firstborn children are killed. The sacrificial lamb, the Paschal lamb, the blood has to be sprinkled on the doorposts of the house. This is a birthing metaphor. It's as if the people have to pass through the womb of the cosmos, or the womb of God, with all the blood and the guts that are involved in an act of birth. But once the baby is born, then you wash the baby. Circumcise, but then the baby has to be kept clean. On that line, by the way, just let me ask, before going back to the question of the goat, which enables me to answer the question which Lenny didn't ask, but I heard him ask, and I'll be able to ask, what sort of language is this? Listen, fellas, you've got to stop doing it all over the place. I absolutely insist that if you're going to do it, you're going to do it there and only there. What sort of language is that? I mean, just forget you're in synagogue for a moment. Here is somebody saying, now look, I'm getting sick and tired. People are doing it all over the place. You've got to stop doing it all over the place. You've got to do it in one place only. Toilet train. Jacob, the only one, and he says it with such a deferential voice. Jacob, so deferential this morning, was so nervous about the implications. This is about toilet training. The people has been born on Pesach, and now it's getting toilet trained. Our Sandy, she's getting all ready for it. A very, very difficult period. We are not called the stiff-necked people for nothing. The obstinate people for nothing. Now, in other words, what is being said here, other peoples shed blood all over the place. Other peoples make sacrifice over the place. Other peoples don't care about blood. And Howard is absolutely right. The reference by implication is to the Canaanites. The ancient Hebrews were much smarter than the modern Jews. When the modern Jews are dealing with their enemies, what they usually do is they publish everything in the Anti-Defamation League Bulletin and then get it into the New York Times and the JTA Bulletin. The ancients were much smarter. They never bothered about their enemies. They ignored them. They decided they would give them no press. There's a German word, totschweigen. You killed somebody by not talking about it. Trudy Weiss Rosmarin once wrote an essay about B'nai B'rith in Germany during the 1930s. Every time some Nazi somewhere way out of nowhere in Bavaria made some comment about the Jew, the German B'nai B'rith made sure that it was on the front pages of every single newspaper in the world the next morning. Now, when people see this sort of thing, they begin to say to themselves, well, maybe if there's smoke, there's fire. Maybe the Jews are up into something. Sometimes it's smarter when people act stupidly to ignore them and treat them with the contempt they deserve. Now, the fact of the matter is that the central myth of Canaanite fertility religion is that the mother creates the baby without benefit of man. This is the original single mother parent myth. That is to say, the ancient mother goddess that was the dominant religious belief in Palestine when our ancestors entered Palestine was the notion that the mother produces the child by herself and then she has sexual intercourse with the child. This is the myth of Tammuz and Adonis. This is the myth of Isis and Osiris. This is the myth of Linus. All the agricultural communities had this notion, and it's obvious to see where it comes from. It's a very primitive experience, pre-agricultural, of trying to understand how it is that during winter the earth is all dry, and suddenly comes spring, it comes to life. Nobody is seen fertilizing the earth. It's true that the rains come, suddenly there is life, but then summer comes, and the green all dries up. From this agricultural basis, the central myth of the ancient Canaanite fertility worship came, that the mother is central, and that the baby is born, but that the baby is killed. There are always lots of other babies. You've seen one, you've seen them all. The ancient fertility rites did not have that sense of uniqueness which we Jews give to our children when we name them the ceremony of bris. Nature produces millions. The image of fertility in the mother goddess religion is more close to the salmon that spawns millions of eggs, of which only a few ever reached maturity and fulfillment. Our ancestors, for very good reasons, were utterly opposed to the incestuous factors underlying the ancient Canaanite fertility rites. And that is why, another reason why we read the story of Achrei Mot, because in it, 2 goats are chosen for an offering to the Lord. One is offered to the Lord, and the other goat is called the goat for Azazel. That goat had to carry upon itself the sins of the entire community. And then it was thrown from the top of a cliff in the hope that all the sins of the people would be thereby forgiven. Now, it's interesting that the word goat is the same word as the word tragedy. The Greek word for goat is the word from which the concept of tragedy comes. The reason is that ancient Greek theater was in fact religion. And one of the central religious acts of the ancient Greeks, as of the ancient pagans, were the bacchanalian revelries, the orgies. What is that famous play by the 5th pre-Christian century Greek playwright of a mother who gets so overwhelmed by the bacchanalian revelries that she cuts the head of her son and doesn't even realize she's done it until it's all over? The Bacchae. This is the ethos that the Hebrews were fighting against. And we see that they didn't entirely succeed, and the issue is still joined. By the way, as far as Howard's point that psychoanalysis was intuited in the Bible, it was, not consciously. The 18th chapter of the book of Leviticus is an adumbration. And in fact, it's interesting that in a recent issue of the International Review of Psychoanalysis, a French psychoanalyst by the name of, the unlikely name of Janine Chasquet-Smergel, wrote a commentary on the 18th chapter of the book of Leviticus, the entire text of which is printed in that article. Unfortunately, there is no time this morning to deal with that issue. I'm going to wind up the discussion right now because we are running a little short of time, and I want simply to say two things here. Firstly, it seems that there is a theme that runs through all readings today. Three kinds of kinship. First, the kinship of blood. This is what Joanne was talking about. The sense of horror that we feel when blood is shed irreverently, when blood is shed without cause, when blood is shed violently. And this initial sense of kinship, which is expressed in the reading, is a sense of violation, not just when human blood is shed, but even when animal blood is shed. You talked about the violence in Central Park. I now link this to the whole problem of ecology. The violence that we are doing to our wells, the violence we are doing to the water, the violence that we are doing to the air, the violence that we are perpetrating against our forests, the grass, acid rain. We are violating the kinship that human beings should feel at their highest level of functioning with every human thing that walks and lives on this earth. The lugworm is our brother, the mouse, the rat, the snake, the bird, the fish, the animals, the plants, the flowers, the trees, the birds. They are all part of the family of life on the cosmos. The first level of our reading then says, we have kinship with nature. Respect that kinship. The second level of kinship is the kinship of family that Dolores was speaking about. We have husbands and wives and parents and children. Respect the difference between family and non-family. In order to have civilization, in order to have healthy human beings, you must turn your back against the ancient Canaanite fertility rites and what they symbolize. What they symbolized in a symbol word was unisex, a total denial of the difference between men and women, between the generations, parents and children, between siblings and strangers. A total denial of any kind of difference. It's interesting that one level of reading the Torah this morning, don't do it all over the place, do it here, which is about toilet training, is the opposite of the ethos of the Canaanite fertility rite. The Canaanite fertility rite has a purpose to suggest that all things on earth are the same. As Descartes talks about there being no difference between a human being and an oyster. That is to say, everything is put into the mouth, however different it may be, but in the anal tract, it is all reduced to the same level. It is the mediocrity which governs modern life. It's the perverse understanding of what democracy means. That if you see one brick standing on another brick, it violates your sense of justice, so you have to take it off. Regrettably, the Reconstructionist movement has become infatuated with this notion of everything being level. There is no difference between rabbi and congregant. Don't let me hear anybody saying that in this synagogue, please. Now, second level of kinship, then, is do not perform incest literally and do not perform incest metaphorically. And the third, which I noticed that you all ignored, that I'm going to have to draw to your attention at the top of page 818, the top of page 509, Halo chivnei chushiyim atem li b'nei Yisrael. Now, come on, my dear friends. We know that Jacob had a little bit of problem with anality this morning, but could I get an honest, open, strident, vocal response, a modern interpretation of what exactly God is saying to the chosen people in this opening verse of the Haftarah this morning? Are ye not unto me as the children of the Ethiopians, or according to my translation, which I think gets the point over much better, to me, O Israelites, you are just like the Ethiopians. Any offers? Any offers? You're being very courteous, Jack. I'm going to be very crude. You're no better than the blacks. Now, I'm saying that in a crude way in order to make a point. I could say you're no better than the Schwarze. That would make a lot of sense to the Jews who use that vile word and think that on some level they are superior to black people or Hispanic people or Arab people or anybody else who isn't Jewish. That the Jews are the chosen people. We're the top dog and everybody else could go to hell. And to this frame of thinking that clearly was around in the 8th pre-Christian century, the prophet Amos says, and oh boy, I wonder what kind of an evaluation he got after this particular sermon. Halo chivnei chushiyim. I mean, chushi, they're the worst, the lowest of the low, the Ethiopians. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting. Moses seems to have had a yen for the Ethiopians because when he married a woman, the second time round, his second wife, the first wife was Yocheved. Who was the second wife? Hushit, the same word. He married an Ethiopian woman. However, Hatzachai, don't get too excited. Don't get too excited. Not as easy as that. It's not as easy as just standing up in front of a bunch of Jews and say, you think you're chosen, are you? Well, you aren't. Not as easy as that. Because in the very next breath, you see, look at this. Just let's look at the reading. I'll follow your reading so that you can follow me on page 509. Are ye not as the children of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel, says the Lord? Have not I brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt? You see, that makes them chosen because God, the Exodus, Passover, Kededra, Charosis, Bitterher, Afikomen, family, chicken soup. Aren't we chosen? I mean, who eats like the Jews when it comes to Pesach? Can you compare Easter eggs with that delicacy in salt water? After the Haggadah and we get to the meal, that prolegomena to the great comestible orgy of the... We only have food orgy. When the Jew says to each other orgy, they don't mean 42nd Street, they mean food. Now, I'm sorry, I have to acknowledge I got that from Jackie Mason. Now, you know what Jackie Mason said? He said, two Goyim get together, two Gentiles get together, one says to the other, you want a drink? Two Jews get together, one says to the other, have you eaten? We've got to be very careful here because Jackie Mason started his career as a rabbi. Now, let's get back to Bob. See, first of all, he says, I brought you out of Egypt. So the audience gets very excited. Oh, he didn't really mean that. He's getting scared. He really meant that God showed us favor. He redeemed us alone. But in the next verse, the prophet says, but the Philistines had an exodus. The worst enemies of the Jewish people. That group most hostile to the Jewish people. By the way, that group which created the Jewish people. There's nothing like having a good set of enemies to make you strong. That is to say, the Philistines were a thorn in the side of the Hebrews, and so the Hebrews united and kicked them out. Sometimes your enemies do you a great service. And not only the Philistines had the Yetziat Mitzrayim, but the Arameans, the Syrians, Gavalt. Do I have to stand in a synagogue and say a good word about the Syrians in 1989? Yes, apparently, from their point of view, God gave them an exodus. Behold, the eyes of the Lord God are upon the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from the face of the earth. This is like the classical good news, bad news, good news, bad news. When I was in England, there used to be a joke. They used to say, the pub, it's like this. It goes a bit like this. There's some terrible news. And the audience says, oh, we're going to have to knock this pub down. Oh, but we're going to build a bigger and better one. Hooray! Got some bad news. Oh, we're not going to have any more of those pint glasses. Oh, we're going to have half-gallon glasses. Hooray! It goes on for about 4 hours, and a lot of drinking is involved, so I won't continue with the rest of it. So, this technique was not invented by the English pub. This technique was used by Amos in the 8th pre-Christian century. Notice how the emotional level of the audience goes up and down, depending on whether he's saying what they want him to hear. Isn't that what we want when we go anywhere? Whether we go to a psychoanalyst or a rabbi or a priest, we want them to tell us what we want to hear. We don't want the doctor or the dentist to tell us what we don't want to hear. I'm awfully sorry, old chap. I'm afraid at least 6 years periodontist visits. We don't want to hear the bad news. Some people go around from doctor to doctor until they find somebody who tells them they don't have a cholesterol problem. The fact of the matter is, the prophet, in raising the hopes of the people and lowering the hopes of the people, yes, you are the chosen people, but you're no better than the Syrians or the Egyptians or the Philistines or the Germans or anybody. But finally something comes through. Now, we don't have the time to go into this principle, which is such a very important principle. I only have time to say the purest and the simplest words about it. There are times in life when there can be no reconciliation. There are times in life when there is no middle ground. There are times in life when there are two opposed viewpoints between which no compromise can be made. Are the Jews the chosen people, or are they not the chosen people? The answer is that if you are a Jew, and I'm speaking for myself, I am chosen and I am not chosen. I am chosen in a bad way. The way when Joanne spoke about the woman in Central Park, I remembered the two reactions I had, of which I am not proud. Number one, that any woman who runs in Central Park deserves to be attacked if she runs in the wrong places, which was a very chauvinistic remark to make, and I am apologizing for it. Why am I apologizing to you? I only said it to myself. The second point that, oh, well, yes, if black people do it, and of course, I mean, you know, obviously what you expect, black people, they had no family there. But it wasn't true. It was this kind of initial reaction. The prophet Amos is trying to tell us to understand that although it is human, as an ethnic, to feel that the other side is all wrong. And we've already hearing black people say that if these had been white kids, we wouldn't have thrown the book at them. We'd have given them permission to go home and not given them heavy bail and so on and so forth. Both sides, blacks and whites, are making ethnic chosen people comments. And you know what? It's understandable. We can't stop it. There's no compromise between feeling chosen and realizing that every other group in the world is just as good and just as bad as you. That as a Jew, I feel I am a member of the chosen people. I say, Asher b'chabanu mikol ha'amin. And yet I know that the blacks, the Irish, the French, the Italians, the Catholics, the Muslims, every other group, the Eskimos, every other group in the world is just as good as the Jews. And the Jews are neither better nor worse. There is difference, but there is no superiority. Now I can hold that belief for about 10 minutes, and then all of a sudden I begin to feel chosen people again. I'm just like the audience that Amos addressed. I'm up and down. I'm up and down. What I'm trying to tell you is the up is the highest level of functioning. We have to try to judge each other and experience each other as individuals, as lovers, as husbands and wives, as Sasha, this is your consolation, Epsukin, as parents and children, as friends. We have to try to judge each other in terms of the highest level of functioning. It's okay if we lose our cool from time to time. It's okay if sometimes we get all worked up and start acting in a very ethnically narcissistic, grandiose way. There was a wonderful piece in the Times a couple of days ago by Yoram Kaniuk. He said, how clever we Jews are. Yoram Kaniuk who tried to shoot the father of the young man he had to sit next to at Columbia University when Arabs and Jews had a symposium recently. And the guy who was at this village, who was on the right-hand side of Yoram Kaniuk, actually killed the father. He shot the father of the son who sat at this Columbia conference. Yoram Kaniuk said, we Jews are marvelous. On Purim, we hate the Persians. On Pesach, we hate the Egyptians. On Tisha B'Av, we hate the Babylonians. We hate just about every group in the world there is to hate. But we do it in the synagogue. And we do it in a stylized way such as we all know that it's not really serious. We are addressing something that's real. It's no good pretend. You see, it was no good saying we aren't the chosen people. It's no good outlawing something that people believe deeply. It's no good saying we aren't the chosen people, and henceforth we will not mention the chosen people, if Jews are still going to somewhere feel that they are chosen somewhere. What you have to do is create a kind of a modus vivendi, not where you make a compromise. You cannot compromise these two ideas. Either you are or you aren't. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest? Is, not are. Only one can win this particular beauty contest. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.